Welcome everyone to our webinar on transport investment, delivering the net zero and wider social benefits. So this afternoon we're going to be discussing the government's current appraisal process for transport schemes and the conflicts between that and shovel-ready schemes in reaching our carbon zero goals. So we're going to hear from three panelists who I'll introduce shortly. Just to introduce myself, I'm Simon Lusby, the Head of Transport Planning, there we go, from City Science. You can find out more about City Science just by looking at our website afterwards, and you'll hear from our CEO throughout this. We're going to hear from the three panelists, and then we'll go through, move to a panel discussion where I'll put your questions to the panel. So please put your questions into the question box and they'll come through to myself. And our team will go through them and then put them forward to the panel. So the panelists are Claire Sherian from Transport for London, Lawrence Oakes-Ash from City Science, and Rafe Smith from Transport Action Network. So I'd like to start by welcoming all three of them and thanking them in advance and hand over to Claire.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Claire Cherian. I work in the city planning part of Transport for London. My team is called Streets Analysis and we look after the long-term future of London's streets. We're not custodians of the streets. We build evidence bases to support interventions and we support investment decisions on multimodal schemes. If you go on 2 slides, please. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges we face when appraising active travel and urban realm schemes, but just to kind of put things in context given the title of our discussion today. When it comes to CO2 emissions, it's clear that road transport has a huge role to play. Road transport contributes around 20% of London's emissions. In London, we have our Mayor's Transport Strategy, and one of the kind of central aims of that is for 80% of travel in London to be done by sustainable modes by 2041. And when we look at the path to trying to achieve a zero carbon city, we can see how influential that mode shift really is to reducing emissions in the capital. So next slide, please. Great, thank you. So obviously with this 80% ambition, that's a split across active travel, but also public transport. But there is huge scope for shift to active modes, in particular to cycling and in particular from car, leading, and this will lead to all important health benefits as well as the kind of environmental side that we're talking about today. Next slide, please. So we have our our strategy document, and this is then, sorry, let me start again. So our mode shift aims are then also coupled with ambitions on improving urban realm and creating better places out of our streets, basically. And this is manifested into plans for comprehensive cycling networks, but also local area-based schemes such as livable neighbourhoods. So next slide. So in TfL, we have a pretty thorough business case process that schemes are taken through, but there are a few areas where we know things could be done differently, or where we've faced particular challenges. So through the kind of strategy work that we do, we can assess these ambitious outcomes for London. We can show how they support growth of the city, how they have wide-ranging health and environmental benefits. But things start to get tricky when we get down to that individual scheme level. And how do we show that this piece is a necessary stepping stone to be done now and taking us to achieve that overall outcome? How do we move from that strategic case to the specific economic case for an individual scheme? We have a wealth of information on that kind of strategic picture, good evidence about these schemes in general, and we can form quite strong qualitative arguments. But how can we bring in quantified scheme-specific benefits, and how can we, if possible, monetize these? Apologies for the spell, auto-corrected Z on monetized there. So in the presentations that follow from my fellow panel members, they're getting into the kind of detail of some of that monetization approach. But before you get there, you need to have good quality inputs, ideally about your scheme, specific to the thing you're actually bringing in. And getting those is tricky, particularly for the types of schemes we're talking about here today. And then we have this additional challenge that we're going up against sometimes more established methods, things that are used routinely and daily, things that quantify disbenefits of congestion that might result from any kind of road space reallocation. So next slide, please. So recognizing some of these issues that we were experiencing in our day-to-day, we set about trying to create quite a broad and ambitious analytical plan that we were going to undertake this year to help kind of improve the robustness of some of our business case guidance. Inevitably, we got a little bit distracted over the last few months, but I'm hopeful that over the next few months, we will start to kind of bring things back on track and revisit these plans, but also look at them in a slightly different way. I think given all the temporary measures and changes that are happening now, we have a lot of real life monitoring data of what things will achieve, and we may potentially have to rely slightly less on our estimation and model processes. So the first area we wanted to kind of think about is quantifying mode shift to active modes from some of these bigger transformational schemes. In London, we are very fortunate that we have developed a cycling model called Cinnamon, and we can use this to look at larger pieces of infrastructure and the mode shift and rerouting that might occur. However, it is still fundamentally a strategic tool, and there are limits to how well it will perform when looking at very small areas. There's also a kind of the reality of a time and staff implication of using quite a big, heavy duty model for every single individual scheme that we might want to look at. So prior to the kind of COVID world, we were starting to formalize internally our process of short-term planning of new infrastructure and kind of streetscape schemes. And we looked at how we could support this analytically and started thinking about annual assessments that could be done of forthcoming sets of proposals. So this would help us break down that kind of multi-decade strategy down into more manageable parts that were going to be delivered in the near term. And we could start to assess these schemes collectively. That would show the collective benefits of a short-term program of investment and would hopefully carry more weight in demonstrating the mode shift benefits of infrastructure. Ultimately, though, you are going to have to justify an individual scheme. And so to prove it has value for money, to prove it has priority. So we were starting to look at a combination of using model methods, observed data, other bits of information that kind of describe these schemes to help start to break down those kind of program level benefits and attribute them to each of the individual scheme components. But we were aware that this wouldn't satisfy everything. We have some schemes that even when packaged together might be too small really to be assessed in this way. And so we had started to look at literature that we could use to kind of come up and with our own London relevant uplift factors. And the idea being that as our cycling monitoring program grew and developed, we'd have specific bits of information that could then be substituted in about past experiences within the city. So a lot of that was going in to kind of help cycling. There was an element there, but we were aware that kind of the pedestrian side of the equation was a bit trickier, needed more attention. So currently, we might kind of capture benefits to pedestrian journey time, ambience benefits, this kind of thing. So the journey time coming from kind of signal changes, but this doesn't necessarily capture the real value people feel that these urban realm changes have. And we thought that there was kind of a bit of a requirement to try and rebalance a little bit, bringing out the pedestrian benefits as strongly as we were currently doing for cycling. So we have a multimodal demand model called Motion, quantifies walking trips, but these aren't assigned to a network. So we wanted to set up some self-service methods where people could kind of understand the local connectivity benefits of schemes and place value on the improvements that were happening. So we wouldn't be coming up with kind of total demand, total movements, but we'd be talking about how changes in a particular place improves access generally. We kind of acknowledge that probably to do this, we might need to commission some primary research. Obviously, kind of things like that are put on hold for the time being. But we would start to be able to provide a quantified output in relation to pedestrians. Might not necessarily get as far as monetisation, but at least it would be kind of specific to that particular scheme. Another thing is, whilst trying to look to assess benefits, you want to also make sure that the disbenefits are being looked at in the right way. So quite often, the disbenefit on the flip side of these schemes are things like congestion and journey time disbenefits. So we wanted to make sure that we were looking at kind of a proper view of what demand might be. So not just the kind of without that scheme view, but could we look at a view of demand that represented this program, this near-term program, and that would reflect some of the mode shift that might be coming up as a sensitivity. And then finally, the bit that was least well thought through, but we acknowledged we desperately needed to do something more on, was how we could bring in new approaches at looking at road risk, how we could look at the role of network changes that supports jobs and homes, both in terms of like highway capacity, but more importantly, where quality of place is improved and how that improves the kind of general attractiveness of area, and then bringing in body of evidence on business benefits and trying to make that more locally specific to assessments as well. So yeah, I think that's my time up. Just a few of the things that we had planned and hopefully would have made good progress on by now, but hopefully we'll be coming back to in the not too distant future. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. So now we'll pass back to, or over to Lawrence Oakes-Ash from City Science.
Thanks, Simon. So I'm going to talk about carbon and how we currently appraise carbon impacts. So I'm going to share with you 3 thoughts with regards to our current approach that highlight some of the challenges and help us think about the ways in which we might need to change our approach to appraisals to align with a net zero carbon world. So next slide, please. So the first thought is all about proportionality, significance, and the tragedy of the commons. So essentially, when should we think about carbon in our appraisals? So next slide, please. WebTag states that at all stages, a proportionate approach should be adopted. Now, I find that statement fairly vague. WebTag isn't exactly a document that's light on detail. So what exactly is it trying to tell us about when and where, when we shouldn't consider carbon? Let's take something like embodied carbon. So embodied or construction emissions could be 30% or more of a scheme. Under the current approach, traded emissions are dealt with by the EU emissions trading scheme. And where they're not covered, we deem that any additional analysis is more likely to be disproportionate. So the result of this is that it's very rare that an independent analysis of embodied carbon actually takes place. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because 20% of the world's carbon can be attributed to the production of 5 key materials, cement and steel being 2 of those. So the civil engineering and highway sector clearly has a huge and influential role to play in driving the right kind of demand to make sure those supply chains decarbonise. So I'd argue that if we're serious about carbon and we've declared a climate emergency, then detailed carbon of every scheme needs to matter. Next slide, please. So then we have a concept of significance. So government policy requires that the carbon impact of any individual road scheme should only be treated as material if the increase in carbon emissions from that scheme would have a material impact of the ability of the government to meet its overall carbon reduction targets. So the problem there is that it's very, very unlikely that any one individual scheme would have such a material impact, but collectively, a large number of schemes might. So this idea, next slide, please. The idea that individual contributions don't matter is ultimately one of the fundamental challenges of climate change. It's like me arguing that I shouldn't do anything because my brother took a plane 8 times last year, or that the UK shouldn't do anything because China is a bigger polluter than us. The net result is what we call the tragedy of the commons, where individually people think their actions are insignificant, but collectively they are. So I think if you declare a climate emergency, somehow you need to understand the cumulative impacts and the impacts on your own targets. Next slide, please. So the next thought is about how we value carbon. Next slide. There are lots of ways to value carbon, and that value has a significant impact on what is and what isn't funded. Unfortunately, whatever method we use, there's a significant amount of uncertainty. Next slide, please. The climate is an inherently complex system with tipping points and feedback loops that could accelerate the path to some pretty bad outcomes. So even back in 2005, estimates for the social cost of carbon were between £0 and £1,000 per tonne. a pretty wide range. So you can understand the desire within government to have something more fixed, more certain, that can be used in appraisal across government. But the danger is that in doing that, we also forget how uncertain those figures are and how sensitive our decisions are to those particular choices. Next slide, please. So we currently use a marginal abatement cost approach. So the current values are shown here on the left. These are the values in WebTag. You can see that the costs become very high, but only in the future. It's also worth remembering that we also apply a discount factor based on the time value of money. You can see the discounted costs here on the right. So we have something that's very difficult to value, highly uncertain, but with a big potential impact on the outcome of our decisions. And then we discount it, which reduces its impact further. Now, I think that's something of a risk. Next slide, please. Time preference, or the time value of money, is a fundamental principle of financial economics. And for money, it's very well established, but it's not necessarily true for everything. So time preference responds to the fact that for money and for many goods, we'd rather receive them today than in a year's time. But let's remember, it's not true for all goods necessarily. And time preference is also not always the best foundation for decision making. Take, for example, pensions. We know that left to their own devices, many people wouldn't save, for their future retirement. They'd use time preference, choosing to consume today rather than thinking about the future. So we actively intervene to make sure that people do make the right decisions for the long term. So that's a great example of where time preference, we actively try to change it. So my point is not that time preference is wrong per se. It's definitely right when you're looking at sort of financial instruments, but rather we must remember it's an expression of a utility function that should be subject to the same critique as the other assumptions in the model. And the key point for decision makers is to understand the sensitivity to the carbon value, but also the sensitivities of the other processes we're applying to that carbon value in the business case. Next slide, please. The final thought is also about economics. In this case, the role of digital technology and productivity and how we think about economic benefits. So economic benefits are the key benefits transport schemes provide, and we estimate them by comparing a do-nothing scenario with the scenarios after the scheme. But we naturally try to envisage the do-nothing world as a fairly stable and static world. However, COVID shows us how unstable or changing the do-nothing world can actually be. For many of us businesses or business owners, COVID has prompted us to question the costs embedded in our old patterns of behaviour. And I just want to share 3 conversations I've had during COVID to highlight this point. Next slide, please. First is with a major energy company. So they're currently operating their offices at 30% capacity and are looking to permanently reduce that footprint by over 40%. The second was with a sales team at a global marketing brand who described the inefficiencies in their previous ways of selling, often with full days wasted travelling to and from customers' sites. Now sales meetings take 30 minutes. And the third conversation with a national construction company. Prior to COVID, they were spending £300,000 per month on fuel to enable employees to get to and from site. They're looking to permanently halve that expenditure and are imposing mileage caps to ensure that they do. So I think these are very, very relevant conversations because here we have direct monetizable benefits that we can identify resulting from not making the trip in the first place. We can value these benefits using consumer surplus or similar methods to what we're using in WebTag today. But they show that there could be considerable productivity benefits in not making trips at all. So some incredible savings that our current appraisal process wouldn't capture. Next slide, please. This reminds me of the triple access approach to transport network design proposed by Glenn Lyons, which recognises that physical mobility is a means to an end, but not the only means. And again, I think this highlights the difficulties of thinking about things as at an individual scheme level. If we focus only on the benefits of a 5-minute time saving without thinking about the potential benefits of not making the trip at all, then we're missing what might be a much more cost-effective or low-carbon option. Next slide. So in my view, yes, we need an appraisal process that achieves consistency, and yes, delivering consistency is based very often on rules, but we also need the ability to design and fund programs of work based on outcomes, using a framework that gives us the flexibility to explore a range of different means of achieving those outcomes. So here's a final thought experiment that I'll leave you with, and something I've been personally thinking about during COVID. So prior to COVID, I was traveling a lot at huge monetary and personal costs. But what if our starting point was to think about all travel as a cost, as lost productivity? I think that would lead to a very different set of decisions being made, ones that would seek to avoid the need to travel at all, but also ones that are more likely to be aligned with our carbon objectives, and in my view, the right kinds of economic outcomes. So those are my initial thoughts. There's lots more I could say, but I'll leave it there and let us go on with the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. I'll now welcome Rafe, but just before he begins, if people can remember to log their questions in the chat, in the question tab on their little box on the right, and then we can go through those after Rafe's presentation. Welcome, Rafe.
Hi, well, I'm delighted to be here today. It's such an unprecedented time to hit reset on how we plan and value transport. Next slide, please. Sorry, next again. So just a quick overview of what I'll be quickly covering today, since there's not much time. I'm going to start by explaining why the largest ever roads programme, Road Investment Strategy 2, is facing a legal challenge. I'm going to then just explain how that fits in, RIS2, with the other frameworks that, as we've just heard from Lawrence, are also problematic for climate and livability. And then to go to say why more than just tinkering is needed. And finally, I just want to very quickly touch on what we can learn from other infrastructure sectors so we can try and draw up net zero compliant transport plans. Very briefly, TAN was set up last year to fill a gap in the market. The big NGOs had pulled back from transport of particular roads, even though that was the biggest carbon sector. It only has 2 part-time people in, so they brought me in to help. My background is as an environmental lawyer, also led infrastructure policy at a national NGO, and including making big changes to the Infrastructure Act 2015. So what's this about the trial? Well, RIS2 is the biggest roads programme ever. It's £27 billion over the next 5 years. And we've actually uncovered figures showing that it's £100 billion over the next 15. Just a few weeks ago, the Department for Transport was rubbishing our case, saying the UN's Paris Agreement obviously wasn't relevant, and it was impossible that its roads plan could reach carbon budgets. Well, I'm really excited to share with you that just a few days ago, as you can see on the right here, the High Court gave us permission to proceed to a full hearing. And it also designated this as a significant case, meaning it will be fast-tracked and heard before announcements on big road schemes due in November. This is a judicial review, however, so it's not second-guessing the merits of RIS2. It's just looking at the legality of the decision. And what's our argument here? Well, the funny thing is the stability that the roads reform agenda in 2015 was supposed to give is now going to possibly be its downfall. That's because the RIS takes many years to set up, and there's a horrifically complex chart I could have shared, but I'm not going to because it's just too much, but it shows you how many years it takes to plan this thing. And in fact, preparation started in 2016 when the carbon target was at 80%. And RIS was largely ready for publication when the government suddenly decided to make net zero the law. It was too late to start again, and of course, late last year, politicians' attention was elsewhere. So what's the DFT saying? Well, it's saying, first of all, it's entitled to defer thinking about net zero until it publishes its decarbonisation plan later this year. Now, that sits oddly with talk of emergency and urgency. And second, it says that climate is a macro-political issue, unsuitable for the courts. We say, obviously, that's not true. So next slide, please. Here's just setting out how the different things fit together. We've heard about appraisal from Lawrence earlier. You can see RIS, how that fits in blue, highlighted in the middle. And there's also planning policy I want to touch on as well. Now, we've gone for RIS as judicial review. You have to challenge a particular decision, even though the whole lot needs change. And you can see on the right-hand side by RIS, there's the investment plan which sets out the scheme. There's also a performance specification that explains the standards needing to be met. The problem is this focuses on economic factors like journey time rather than environmental or social factors. Now, why is that a problem? Next slide, please. The so-called the carbon conundrum. The chart on the left is from the decarbonisation consultation. You can see how transport in turquoise has pretty much had the same emissions since 1990. The table or the bars on the right show the levels that are needed. The purple one in the middle shows what the DfT is aiming for in its consultation and saying that's really challenging. But actually it's the figure on the right, the red one, that's where they should be aiming following the net zero law. So basically the consultation is aiming for twice the emissions that it should be. Next slide, please. Now, my first slide talked about a reset. This is what a reset looks like. This is the M25 in April. Pretty unrecognizable. And on the right-hand side, you can see a chart from the Committee on Climate Change's annual report last month. This shows quite how much emissions have been reduced during lockdown, and the biggest one is surface transport. The problem is if you just reboot with the same software, or rather the same policy and investment plan, you're going to end up with the same problems. It's like throwing petrol on the embers of a house fire. Next slide, please. Now, many people, particularly those in the department, are hoping electric cars will save us. And here is Elon on the left-hand side promoting his latest car. The trouble is the figures that the Transport for Quality of Life consultancy recently published show that the RIS2 will make emissions rapidly shoot up, even if there's a very swift rollout of electric vehicles. By contrast, we need to reduce transport emissions, and these are over a 5-year period rather than the annual figures on the previous slide, far more quickly. But it's not just that challenge, there's also freight, which isn't going to be electrified soon, or what I call the wider carbon impacts, where there are critical resource constraints such as rare earth metals, and also the land use impact. If we all shift to electric cars, motoring will become much cheaper. In fact, looking at about a 200% increase in traffic by 2050, all other things being equal. That would require a huge amount of land. At the same time, we need much more land for nature, for carbon sequestration, and so on. And this is the sort of thing I'm calling a wider carbon impact, inspired by the wider economic impacts in WebTag. Next slide, please. So, is the government moving quickly? Well, it's talking about project speed, but when it comes to carbon, it's really project sloth. We saw in Lawrence's presentation the mention of this policy saying that you basically assume that unless a particular road scheme will take us out of the carbon budget, you ignore that. This is the National Networks NPS, and we've been asking the government to review it for some months now. In fact, it should have started reviewing this last summer when the net zero law came through. The best we're told is that there'll be a decision put to ministers this autumn. So on the one hand, we're hearing they want to speed up infrastructure. On the other hand, we're seeing that they're taking a very long time, over 15 months, to look at national policies to see if they're carbon compliant. And this is so important because objectors to schemes are not allowed to oppose on carbon grounds on the basis the government has a credible strategy in place. Now, this is the same government that in March said, we've got a problem on transport, what are your ideas? I can't share much more about this, it's all rather sensitive, but watch this space. Next slide, please. Claire mentioned unlocking housing, and that's really important when it comes to strategic transport because so much investment in RIS2 is focused on unlocking housing. The question is what sort of housing and where? Now, however much tech you throw at transport, it won't change the reality that big roads, big car parks are not livable places. You can see the contrast in the slide in front of you. Next slide, please. So a major commission gave very clear evidence to the government this year saying that car-dominated places just don't tend to be so nice to hang out in. And since then, COVID has highlighted the importance of living somewhere that's nice to spend time in rather than just somewhere to pass between home and a drive-through. Now, this photograph I took on a bike ride during lockdown, and it shows, what's actually quite attractive housing, but basically the space between the housing is a big car park where 9 out of 10 of the cars are SUVs. What type of place is that to live in? Next slide, please. So I wanted just to end by comparing innovation around net zero across infrastructure sectors. This is the most interesting bit for me. Now, comparing Ofgem, which covers energy, and the Office of Rail and Road for Strategic Transport, there's a massive difference here. Ofgem is looking systematically, thinking about how to curate a different business ecosystem. By contrast, ORR is just focused on delivering cheaper roads faster. Innovation is things like cheaper asphalt surfacing. It feels a bit like efforts by Kodak in the 1990s to develop better film coatings at the time when there were huge changes in digital photography coming forwards. The key thing that's missing is that RIS1 was proposing a carbon emissions user metric. That's also required in international standards such as the one on this slide. But it seems that was pulled at the last minute because DFT realised if you start looking at the emissions from the strategic road network, that would make its plans look very bad. So that was pulled. So to conclude, yes, big changes are needed, but also a radically different vision. Next slide, please. So here are some details. We are still raising funds for our case because we're likely to have to go to the Court of Appeal. Either side is likely to appeal. This is the first time the Infrastructure Act has been tested in court, and we don't expect the government to back down easily. So anything you can do to help promote our systemic challenge would be appreciated. And I really look forward to hearing your questions and comments now in the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Rafe, and thanks to Claire and Lawrence, who I assume will be joining me. There we go. So now we'll move over to some questions from the audience, and the panel will answer those. So I've got a few here that came through quite early on. So Claire, many of the major spending decisions are effectively decided at a national level. What do you think the impact of this is, and is there anything that local authorities can do about it?
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's one as well that is affecting us in London more, I'd say, and obviously a lot more in our current financial situation. I think we've been rather spoilt in our position historically, where we're have been trying to we've had a little bit more autonomy about how we spend. We can set out our own strategies and kind of deliver against those. I think we will be in the future playing to a much more national picture as kind of funding pots become available. I guess I am reasonably hopeful in that, despite what we're saying about kind of speed and scale, that at least there is starting to be some alignment around goals on active travel, on environmental outcomes. And I think part of the process will also be about showing people who kind of approve funding bids and things like that, that our own methods and ways of doing things are correct, and are kind of having that conversation about what the guidance says and how we want to do things and demonstrate them. So I think there's probably a lot of kind of pre-work that has to go in to then be able to demonstrate that why the local decisions are the ones that kind of make sense, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. And over to Rafe. So the government clearly wants to stimulate the economy with shovel-ready schemes. Is there a danger that we could see more legal battles around these schemes? And what sort of projects would you think the government should be prioritising to, at this time?
Well, I mean, there's definitely a lot of legal battles going on, but as we saw with the decision by Client Earth on Drax, where there was a new power station, because of the way the planning system is set up, it's difficult to raise carbon grounds at the scheme level. You have to challenge it right at the strategic level, which is what we're doing. In terms of shovel-ready schemes, I mean, the most obvious are, of course, potholes. There's a huge 10–15 billion pound backlog on local roads. That's something that does need to be dealt with pretty quickly. But I think there's a lot we can learn from TfL in London in terms of cycling infrastructure. I actually came up with the idea of the cycling walking investment strategy and got that into the Infrastructure Act. We didn't hear any news about that yesterday, strangely, in the government's massive cycling announcement. Really what local authorities outside London need is a stable funding pipeline so they can have schemes ready to deliver when the government's largesse kind of hands out some more cash. And that's not there yet. So I'm waiting with bated breath to find out more about the government's plans there.
And so Claire, just to respond on that TfL point, and then we'll come to Lawrence. With cycling levels so low in many other cities, like obviously Cambridge and London are doing quite well, but how should officers be taking into account the potential savings of putting in cycling infrastructure as opposed to putting in another lane for traffic?
The savings in terms of?
So the potential benefits, I should say, of cycling and walking as opposed to widening the road.
Yeah. So I think it goes back a little bit to what I was trying to say in my bit, which was probably that individual lane is not necessarily going to kind of stand up on its own. And so it's about talking about what that lane or what that extra capacity for active travel is trying to take you towards, and what that overall outcome is trying to then do for your location. And in particular, I think if you can start to look longer term, so obviously these assessments are multi-year assessments, but there's quite often a lot of extrapolation that happens rather than looking at how utilized something might be later on down the line. I think you can then start to build up that case. So one lane on its own is not doing anything very much maybe, but one lane is part of a bigger connected network linking household and office locations, for example. You then start to make that bigger argument. I think it's about not trying to replicate the process, go through the motions. It's thinking a little bit differently about how you can kind of pitch it, because otherwise why were you doing it in the first place, I guess, is kind of the point.
And to Lawrence, how do we reconsider the way we appraise these transport schemes, and how do we incorporate wider social benefits and the carbon cost?
Well, I think that the first question really referred to the idea that a lot of the decisions are already made before it gets down to the people who are putting the business cases together. I think if you kind of look at how the Green Book, you should be looking at your options first. But if your options are predetermined, then you're not really doing a business case at all. So actually, I think that the powers need to be with the localities, with the regions who know what's going to deliver for their regions, to be able to make a much greater assessment. Do we want road schemes? Do we want rail schemes? Do we want bus schemes? Do we want cycling? So actually being able to make those choices and make the argument. And I think the other thing that's sort of coming out from this is the idea that you should be able to evaluate the impacts of a holistic set of packages. So, for example, if you've got a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan, can you determine what the full impact of that is, rather than rushing to evaluate one particular scheme for a particular piece of funding as it's coming out? So I think that long-term funding is critical, but then giving powers to people to make real decisions about which modes to invest in, that's also critical.
Can I just make one quick suggestion? It shouldn't just be the highway authorities. It should also be the local planning authorities looking at this. Obviously in London they're the same, but there's lots of money from developers, well, at the moment maybe, for things like community infrastructure levy. If local authorities have that in place, then they can start to take some of the money strategically to start creating, a local walking and cycling network. But they will need to get that through planning processes, some sort of evidence base, and that's where appraisal and modelling can be really valuable.
So if someone was wanting to challenge a draft local plan on carbon emission grounds, how would you, have you seen that happen? How would you go about that? Right.
So can you just repeat that? You went quiet for a second.
Oh, sorry. So this is a question from Matthew Snicker. Sorry about the pronunciation. Do you have any advice on challenging draft local plans on carbon emission grounds? So this goes back to like garden villages and other things where we're building in areas which are blatantly going to be car orientated.
It's a really difficult question. I think, is it in relation to, say, energy or other areas that the planning policy is quite clear, saying there should be radical reductions? In relation to transport, the policy is much weaker, and maybe yesterday's announcement, it's a bit unclear actually. I was trying to read that before the session, thinking, are they going to change planning policy or not? Without that, it's difficult. But I think as cases such as the case on Heathrow in February comes through, hopefully our case in October, these will be precedents that you can start to raise with local authorities or if need be, in examinations in public.
And Claire, do you think that is the guidance the problem, or is it how we're interpreting the guidance and how we have been interpreting the guidance?
I mean, I kind of believe that there is a huge amount of flexibility actually in the guidance, and that if you can make your case for the way that you have done your assessment and done things in the kind of spirit of the guidance, I think that you should be able to get somewhere with that. I think, however, that takes a huge amount of time, and that is what we don't have when we are trying to deliver these things. And people want a kind of clear process, the path of least resistance. And I think also, if you're looking nationally, you don't want certain areas to be doing things better or more interpretively than others. So I think it is an absurdly difficult task to create that guidance in the first place, to get that to get the balance right. But I think there is probably a responsibility on us to be more imaginative with it, I think.
So I guess that's a good move to Lawrence then. Do you think we need explicit modal targets and elements like that, how would you respond to Claire's point about being a bit more creative with the guidance?
So I don't think that you necessarily need clear modal targets. I think that it would be helpful for locations to have an understanding what their carbon budget is. So having the budget broken down by individual levels would enable people to say, okay, I've got this list of schemes that I want to do, but I can only afford this amount of carbon. I think that would help people prioritize the things that they're doing in relation to the carbon element. But obviously carbon isn't the only issue that people are trying to face. So do we move on from carbon budgets to XYZ budgets? So you can kind of see the complexity in that. I mean, I think with regards to, it's very difficult to be, I think, too interpretive of the guidance, because at the moment the guidance is what we say is robust. Now, my judge of a decision is to what extent has it been challenged. Has it been challenged enough, and that's that's how I determine whether it's robust or not, because it's stand up to scrutiny. And I don't necessarily think that the current way we do it does. But I think it's very difficult to become more imaginative in the way that you try to apply it, given that ultimately you're looking to secure funding from a pot where you've got an external person telling you whether it's right or not.
I mean, there's a big issue here that the national forecasts, which are the road traffic forecasts 2018, they became out of date within months because of the net zero target. Now London has its own mayor's transport strategy and targets, but outside that, if you're a local authority trying to put a case together, if you rely on the Department for Transport's numbers, that they're clearly not compliant, as the DfT basically admitted in its March consultation. So, you know, not saying you've got a completely blank canvas, but it's difficult. I think that's where good modelling of different scenarios would be really valuable.
I think the thing that surprises me is the extent to which local authorities haven't grouped together, you know, because given so many have declared a climate emergency, the thing that surprises me is that there isn't a collaborative effort across all of them to change what's going on at national level, to make it much more easy for them to essentially enact zero carbon policies, because many of them have got zero carbon targets of 2030, which, you know, the actions required are so much more ambitious than what would be required to 2050.
And so, right, you've obviously got a court case going on at the moment. If that succeeds or fails, what do you think the result of that's going to be on the wider transport business case concept?
I think if it fails, you know, if the worst case, there will still be a lot of, I think it'll be a noble defeat, because the department will have to serve its evidence in the next month, and a lot of detail. It's going to have to actually set out in detail what its plans are and justifications are and why. And that's going to be very valuable in itself, showing effectively that the department wears no clothes when it comes to carbon. But I mean, without knowing how we're going to lose, if we are, and I'm saying we're still very confident we're going to win, it's a bit difficult to go any further than that at the moment.
Okay, so I guess, you know, you're challenging a lot of road at the moment. So Claire, coming back to you, do you think that road building still has a place in UK investment? And what would you advise local authorities should be doing about their road schemes that they're looking to currently progress? Do they need to change their approach in some way?
Do I think there's a case for road building in the UK as a whole? I mean, it depends on what the reason for that road is, right? You could see examples where you might want to, for air quality reasons, potentially, remove traffic out of certain more populated areas onto some kind of bypass system. You know, like that has a kind of pretty strong case there. I think the problem is that you need to look at things alongside what you're trying to do to manage demand. So again, it's these things not in isolation. You're doing this as part of an overall ambition to get where exactly. How is that helping to facilitate it? Even if it's not something that you would typically consider to be good in terms of helping achieve your outcomes, it may actually have a role. So I think you can't have a kind of blanket rule there. And then, sorry, what was the second half?
How do city or how do local authorities need to change their approach to around those road schemes if they want to get them through?
Yeah, I mean, and get them through is kind of different. There's different audiences that you're trying to get them through, isn't there? There's potentially your DfT getting them through so you can receive funding. There are your stakeholder groups, which will be vast and on every opinion. There'll be your local politicians. So a road, I mean, I probably would just end up repeating what I said earlier. I think it's what that particular bit of road investment is doing. I mean, if something's about to fall down, you probably need to do something about that fairly swiftly. Had you foreseen it falling down, could you have done something different is a different question and probably a bigger kind of point. But yeah, I think you've got to look through these things through the different lenses of the different outcomes you want to achieve for your city. It's a kind of strategic assessment on that piece, as well as the more specific churning through the kind of process one.
Okay, so we were talking about there like bypasses and how they might change. There might be actually ways to deliver roads but also reduce carbon as a result, or reallocate carbon, that's where it is. We've got people talk a lot about carbon budgets and reevaluating how we do carbon costs. Lawrence, what's your view on that? Do you think that something needs to change in that space? Is it a good idea to set some carbon budgets?
Well, so I think the first thing to note is that obviously since the net zero target, BEIS are looking at the carbon valuation, so that the MAC curves, they are reassessing the approach to carbon valuation in light of the new target. So there will be a change, and it was just last week where essentially the guidance is now to stress test the carbon at the top end of that MAC curve range that I showed. I think that there are issues, you know, my view with carbon and climate change is we cannot fully understand the economic costs, and I think that those catastrophic costs are so hard to value, and that's why I'm not sure it's right to treat them in the traditional economic way. You know, you need to take a decision early in order to avoid that outcome, and it's a very difficult decision to make. But there are, you know, COVID is an example where, you know, early intervention was essential to getting the right outcomes. That is not something I think that traditional business cases are adept to dealing with. I certainly think that if there were individual carbon budgets for local authorities, then it would get over this issue where the cumulative impacts issue. You know, so then if you've got a large road scheme or a large scheme of any kind going on in your region, then you'd assess the impacts of that scheme against your budget. So at the moment, obviously, the rule is if it impacts the government's overall target and it's immaterial, then it would still go ahead. You know, having smaller targets around the country would then obviously make more things proportionate in that regard.
Yeah, I think actually having local carbon budgets is a really good idea for local authorities that have made, you know, climate emergency declarations and want to actually show their leading rather than just, you know, waving a piece of paper around. But what I would say is just comparing the difference between, you know, valuing carbon as a consumer and putting on a carbon price for businesses, and in an appraisal case that's looking at 60 years. I think even if you know, tripled, quadrupled carbon values going into tag appraisals, that would still be a very small part of the, you know, the costs in a benefit cost ratio. By contrast, time savings aggregated over 60 years will be much larger. So, you know, I don't think at all that the BEIS proposal is credible, particularly looking at, you know, my earlier slide showing the scale of the reduction required. It's just not a credible way to use what might work for individual businesses in a 60-year appraisal case.
And I think working with a kind of total quantum of carbon emissions, like that offers huge amount of flexibility. Like I think local authorities have been trying to grapple with much more complicated things around local air quality in specific locations and specific exposures. And that's really hard, actually. Like that, you start making potentially some very odd choices sometimes in that kind of world, whereas a kind of essentially what it is total amount of activity is kind of a more straightforward thing to deal with, motorized activity. It allows you to more easily see your trade-offs, I think, probably.
I mean, one caveat I put in there is where you draw the boundary of the system you're looking at. There's awareness that if we do shift to electric vehicles very quickly, the embedded cost of building those vehicles, suddenly having to replace tens of millions of cars on the roads, that will have a big carbon impact, whether they're built here in Britain or in Germany or somewhere else. And if we're simply looking at the system in terms of the road network and not the impacts beyond, that will have consequences if we're going for rapid economy-wide decarbonisation.
That actually reflects back on a question from Daniel, who said, are we looking at the construction costs of a scheme that might save carbon over 60 years, but over a 60-year period, but the construction, we're not decarbonising that. So we're actually embedding the carbon to start with and then not saving it over time. Lawrence, do you think there's ways to work around or to tie that into the equation?
Well, I think one of my kind of issues with kind of the MAC curve, is that these are costs to abate carbon, but there's somebody else's costs. I think it'd be much better if, even if whatever curve we're using, you know, there was an actual legal commitment to take that out of the atmosphere as part of that scheme. You know, then it would guarantee that those schemes are carbon neutral. Now, you know, there'd be other complexities as to are they really doing that? But I think that's the danger with just looking at it as a cost, because we essentially say the cost is going to be £500 per tonne in 2050, but who's paying that? You know, so I think if it can be associated with the scheme, then those costs can be abated as part of that contractually. Then I think we're in a safer place.
And Claire, seeing as Transport for London is kind of like a sub-regional transport body, what do you see the role of sub-regional transport bodies play in controlling carbon budgets? Should they have a role?
I suppose I can only really comment on the way that it would work at doing things at London versus borough level. I guess I probably couldn't really comment exactly on how well that translates elsewhere. I think just purely because people don't adhere to the boundaries of the places they live and work, you must kind of be making these considerations, where your employment centres are, where your housing centres are, how you develop. It's all part of a very interconnected system. And I think that kind of working across the piece is hugely effective, not least because you can coordinate the trialling and demonstration of things as well, you know, as well as that kind of bigger management piece.
So I really agree with that. I think in governance terms, you know, England is a very big, large country, and simply having a DFT at one end and then, you know, local highways at the other, it's too big, and you need some sort of intermediary body. I mean, some time ago there were government offices that would kind of go for each region, and not saying I want to exactly recreate that, but having something in between to help allocate carbon is really valuable. I know some people proposing that Highways England should have a carbon budget. The trouble is, you know, if you are driving from, say, Bromley to kind of Dudley and Birmingham, you know, which local authority or which highway authority should be, you know, bearing that budget? You can imagine, you know, there's this debates on rail operators, you know, who's liable for 100 people on a train having to get refunds because of something on the line. Given how tight the carbon constraints are going to be in the years to come, you can imagine, you know, lawyers battling over which authority has to bear the carbon of various trips. We do need to find a way of allocating responsibility that is, you know, simple and effective, rather than getting bogged down.
Okay, and I think that both of those are absolutely spot on for that. Now, as an industry, this is from Edward Lay. So, as an industry, business as usual is building roads, or it has been for a very long time, and we've got a lot of people trained in design and build of road infrastructure. How do we get the government to support retaining those skills, but also helping new people upskill for building cycling facilities, building bus rapid transit, looking at travel behaviour change? How do we upskill that? Anyone want to take a go at that?
Well, I mean, I think if it comes down to the budget again, the high level budget of the capital commitments, because, you know, if we're spending £2.9 billion on professional services in the UK every year, it's supporting some kind of capital investment, and that is 800 million of fees related to roads, 800 million of fees related to rail. You know, it's if the budgets were changed, then the industry would very quickly move for skills to the different areas. You know, I think it's a very adept and nimble industry, and I think we've got some great people who are very quick to learn. So I don't necessarily think it requires a huge amount of support. I think if the budgets were changed and the focus was changed, then the industry would adapt very quickly.
I saw a survey that's not quite been published yet by one of the biggest consultancies in infrastructure in the UK, that was asking, you know, apprentices, new recruits, what was motivating them to become engineers or, you know, work in that sector. And right at the top were issues like climate change. And I think actually having a vision that is appealing to younger people or those changing careers, showing why this sector is important to making a difference for the future is crucially important. I think that's missing a bit at the moment, because though the government has this high level saying climate change is really important, it hasn't yet filtered through to a lot of the transport visions. And that's the case in the rail sector. Yeah, in cycling we hear it, but again, there is only a £2 billion pipeline, so maybe not so appealing in terms of the size of the market. So really there's more action needed by government there.
And with COVID, we've seen a lot of digital technology suddenly becoming more in use, you might say, and a lot more home working forced at present. And we could see digital technology substituting physical infrastructure. Lawrence, what do you think the space is there for more digital technology rather than physical infrastructure?
I mean, I think the key thing is that we need an appraisal process that acknowledges it as an option. So I think that we've got outcomes that we want to deliver, and we've got very set ways of thinking about how we deliver those outcomes. And I think there's a lot of research that we need to do, post-COVID, about agglomeration, what that looks like in a kind of a digital world, because we think about the agglomeration benefits of coming to a city always being determined by transport, but actually companies have moved beyond that much faster. So startups always think about what the network effects are. We have this concept of digital network effects, but again, it's something that we don't capture in traditional economic models. So I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done to really understand genuinely how you create economic benefit by achieving agglomeration or other sorts of outcomes. But it doesn't necessarily have to be driven by transport-led transport-led agglomeration. So that's just one example.
And Claire, what's TfL doing in that space at the moment? I know you do a lot of scenario testing as part of the Mayor's Transport Strategy. I don't believe COVID was one of those.
No.
Working maybe one of the scenarios. Can you give any insights into what TfL might start doing in terms of its modelling approach with home working in mind?
Yeah, so you're right in saying that we had a series of long-term scenarios that were looking at the kind of uncertain future of London and different kind of routes that we might go down, more technologically based, more distribution of growth into other parts of the country. I mean, what we've found is that quite a lot of those things that we were looking at are also quite relevant to the COVID-related discussion. So particularly the nature of agglomeration, spreading the money out across the regions, that kind of thing. And so we have been kind of looking at how we take those scenarios and rethink them, given the kind of COVID picture and the changing attitudes. It is interesting though that it's kind of the same set of stuff. Yes, there isn't this kind of blip, but where you're kind of heading is sort of the same different lines that we could have been on before. It just determines which of those maybe we might finally find ourselves on.
Do you think it's fair to say, Claire, that perhaps COVID and also the challenge of the decarbonisation reduction that we need perhaps shows we need much more extreme scenarios to stress test appraisal and visions?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible example of something happening in real life. Like the absolute suppression of activity is ridiculous. How you then can generate that in a way that then still allows a society to function is the main problem, isn't it? And I think you see how quickly people have been to want to get away and to travel again now that we can kind of do those things. It makes me doubt a little bit how much it fundamentally will change outcomes, but maybe it's more that our lives become a bit more unreliable, and that then brings to the fore the need for the kind of scenarios and the big kind of tests there, rather than necessarily large attitudinal change. The number of friends who have gone off on holiday, I'm very, very sad and jealous, basically.
I think from the perspective of businesses, there's definitely going to be cost drivers, which mean that a lot of these behaviours are embedded. And I think that those cost drivers I tried to refer to with my 3 examples are going to be the thing that we kind of see persist. I think the thing that's interesting about COVID is, if we were talking about digital technologies or it being an option, if we're having this conversation without COVID having taken place, we would all still be saying, oh no, we can't work from home, it can't happen. And I think that it's that cultural element where we can make bigger changes than we think we can. That's so interesting in the whole piece of it.
And this is a question moving back away from COVID for a moment, back to carbon infrastructure. This is a question for each of you in turn, I guess. Are you aware of any? This is from James Golding Graham, and I apologise if I've mispronounced anyone's names. In terms of CO2 appraisal, are any of the panel aware of a tool that facilitates the high-level assessment of carbon impacts on new infrastructure and enables services or better connectivity, such as additional road capacity versus demand-responsive transport or better digital connectivity? Have any of you come across tools like that?
Oh, so hi James. Obviously, I think everything at the moment is a bit bespoke. There is the City Science decarbonisation tool that you can use to look at the different schemes, but there isn't anything that we've seen that does sort of the digital element of that. I think that at the moment what you need is some sort of high level piece. But I think that's something we'll have to think about.
Sorry, that was seriously a question. Claire or Rafe, have you seen anything that is appraising carbon as part of schemes?
I've seen the Department for Transport's carbon tool, and it didn't seem particularly accurate. I mean, something to get you thinking, but not something I'd recommend.
Yeah, and again, a little bit like Lawrence said, I mean, I think we've got bespoke things that we've bespoke guidance that we ask people to use, feeding off of kind of model outputs of vehicle activity or whatever, and then we have the methods that are under our greenhouse gas inventory that we try to make things consistent with as well, particularly when we do strategic assessments. But it's all kind of locally generated. It's not something that we've picked up from elsewhere.
Okay, and just before we wind anything up, I'd just like to get final words from each of you in the order that you presented. So, Claire, any final thoughts on this?
Just firstly, thanks to everyone for your questions. It's really weird not being able to look into the whites of your eyes while I answer, though. So hopefully I've not said anything that you want to come and find me on LinkedIn and argue about afterwards, but you're more than welcome to. And I think it's really great to be able to think about this challenge both from the measures end, and then how you really bring home that message about why the carbon benefits matter. And I think you've got to tackle it from both sides. You can't just be kind of getting really great modelling methods sorted and then not be making a very strong case on quantifying your carbon. You've got to kind of be pursuing both. So yeah, no, thanks everyone.
Lawrence?
So I guess I think that if you've declared a climate emergency, and I think it's really important to understand what carbon's happening. So I think, making sure that carbon is considered proportionate in the way that you do your assessment, understanding the sensitivities to the carbon value. You can go above and beyond the guidance to understand, your own carbon value, your own social cost of carbon, and see what the sensitivities are. And I think the more evidence that you've got, that you've demonstrated that, the less likely you are to be taken to court by people who may wish to take you to court. So I think good consideration of carbon is obviously going to be great and essential to getting the scheme through, and also making sure that stakeholders understand that you've considered it.
Thanks. Well, I'd like to end by saying thanks everyone for your interest and for your questions as well. I suppose what's interesting is how fast people can change, but how slowly it takes for infrastructure providers to change their plans and strategies and investments. How obviously agile is a big buzzword, but going forward, given the carbon reductions needed, the cumulative reductions needed year on year, we're all going to have to be more agile. What does that mean for local authorities, for infrastructure providers, balancing certainty in terms of attracting investment and jobs and so on, but also when the facts change, being able to change your plans. And I think that remains a difficult question. There's no easy answer. It's more about a change in attitude and vision and skills.
Okay, so I'd like to thank the three panelists on behalf of everyone, seeing as no one else can talk, and thank the audience and for raising all the questions throughout all of this. Obviously, there's a rather large issue here to deal with going forward. I really hope that none of us find each other on the opposite side of a legislative table, so to speak. But yeah, thanks to the panel. Thanks for Landor for arranging this, and hope to see you at future webinars. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks, Simon, as well. Cheers.